Okay, welcome everybody. Thanks for coming. My name is Wolf Gruner. I'm a professor of history here at USC and the director of the USC Shoah Foundation Center for Advanced Genocide Research. It is my distinct pleasure to present our speaker for today. But before I do this, I have to pay some gratitude to the USC Department of Middle Eastern Studies and its chair Ramsey Ruigi, who supported this talk, and also to the staff of the center and Francesca, who was responsible for the catering. So thanks to all of these different people involved to make this talk happen. I want to just briefly introduce Uğur Üngör, who is currently a visiting professor at UCLA, so across town. And he is well known internationally as one of the leading scholars on the Armenian genocide, which he's not talking today about. You see it's a very different topic, although it kind of resulted from his studies on the Armenian genocide. He earned his PhD in 2009 at the University of Amsterdam, and he is currently an associate professor of history at Utrecht University, also in the Netherlands. And I don't know exactly what it means, but he may explain this. He's a research fellow at a very important institution in the Netherlands, which is researching, it's called like national, what is it? The NIOD? War documentation. So documentation of the war, which includes the Second World War, but not only. And I think it's kind of branching out into also other genocides and colonial history of the Netherlands and Indonesia and so on. So his research interests are kind of state formation with a particular focus on mass violence. He is not only well known but also very successful. So his books and also his general work was awarded several prizes, and especially the Young Scientist Award for History in 2012, so this is a while ago, from the Royal Netherlands Academy of Science. So that's a pretty prestigious award which he got. He is very well known in the genocide studies field for several books on genocide topics, like his award-winning The Making of Modern Turkey, Nation and State in Eastern Anatolia, which he published with Oxford University Press in 2011. And then Confiscation and Destruction, The Young Turks' Seizure of Armenian Property, also published in 2011. And Genocide News Perspectives on its Causes and Consequences, published in 2016. He was already here at USC 4 years ago. He gave a very interesting presentation, and this is where I see the bridge between his genocide studies and the current topic. That the talk in 2015 covered the Kurdish militia during the Armenian genocide from two different angles. One, to perceive them as perpetrators, and on the other hand, to look at them also as some of them actually performed rescue acts during the time. So as a very ambivalent force. And I think from there, his kind of interest in comparative militia studies is coming. And this is where what he's working on now, to compare these paramilitaries in different genocides, and specifically, more recently, the work on Syria. So give a warm welcome to Uğur Üngör.
Thank you very much, Wolf, and everybody at USC for the very warm welcome. It's a great pleasure to be back here in a different formation and in a different context. But of course, always with the similar or with the same interest in mass violence and in understanding the dynamics of mass murder. So, just following up on what Wolf said about my kind of changing interests. I want to say a few things about it before we get on to the talk. Namely, so in 2015, this was the centenary of the Armenian genocide. It's been 100 years. There were conferences all over the world. I went to a few of these conferences, and right in that year, as I was still immersed in the documents of 100 years ago, listening to oral histories of 100 years ago, right at that time, actually in the summer of 2015, the Armenian Genocide Memorial Church in the Syrian city of Deir ez-Zor. Deir ez-Zor, of course, the center of where Armenians were deported to. One of the major, if not the major, memorial churches in that city was blown up by ISIS. Now this kind of sent a little bit of shockwaves, of course, through Armenian communities as well as through Syrian ones. And for me, it was a bit of a wake-up call in that, I was interested in a genocide. It was 100 years ago, whereas similar forms of violence, maybe not exactly the same thing, but nothing is ever the same thing. Similar forms of violence were ongoing in Syria, so and in Iraq, of course, neighboring Iraq. So I changed tack a bit. I focused a little bit on the contemporary violence, and I began on researching the dynamic of state violence in Syria. Now this, of course, necessitated a shift in methodology. So not only kind of the historical methods of examining documents, looking at written primary sources, but also necessitated a kind of a range of ethnographic methods in that there was ongoing conflict. Most of the actors were alive, survivors were pouring out of the country. So if you want to learn something about it, you have to go and interview people. So I went out and interviewed several dozens of people. I did about 80 interviews with Syrian survivors and then another about 40 with perpetrators. And one of the topics, one of the many topics you could focus on were the state, pro-Assad government militias that were wreaking havoc in Syria. And so my talk today will be on these militias. And to give you a taste or a bit of a sense of what we're talking about, I'd like to present to you the following gentlemen. Now, in the month of August 2015, right, so the same month that thing was blown up at the church, on the other side of Syria, something interesting or something bizarre happened. Namely, two cars were driving down the central city, or the coastal city of Latakia. And one car was overtaken by the other, and they met again at the next traffic lights. Then the car that was overtaken blocked the intersection. The gentleman who was driving that car, here on the right, Suleiman al-Assad, 19-year-old nephew of the president, got out of his car with his AK-47, walked to the other car, opened the door and killed the driver of the car. 7 shots to the chest, the man died immediately. Now you might argue, this is a civil war going on in this country, these type of murders happen almost daily, so what's the big deal here? Well, the interesting thing is that what happened afterwards, so what unfolded, was really a microcosm not only of the conflict in Syria itself, but actually of these militias that we're talking about. Because Suleiman himself, this is a photo of him posing with his favorite shotgun, which he posted on his Facebook page, by the way. It was or he is the son of one of the major leaders of the, what I call Shabbiha militias, the paramilitary groups that I started researching. So his father was one of the top guys, and at some point his father died in skirmishes in the country, and so he kind of stepped up and took that position at the very young age of 19. Now he thought he was Lord and Master of Syria, right? And even with that last name, obviously you have so much privilege, and he thought he could get away with a murder like that. But what happened is that the victim who was driving that car, which just overtook the guy, nothing special here, the victim was none other than the gentleman on the left, Colonel Hassan al-Sheikh, who was a decorated war veteran in the Syrian Air Force and a war hero, quote unquote. Now, what happened after that is very interesting. Namely, the case this was a normal criminal case. It went to the police, and the police, as soon as they found out that the perpetrator was likely Suleiman al-Assad, because the murder happened in broad daylight, as soon as they realized the murderer was Suleiman, they said, well, the brother of the victim, who was sitting in the passenger seat and saw the whole thing, not to mention dozens of other eyewitnesses, the police said, well, you probably misremembered. You're traumatized, you don't remember this well, let's forget about this. Brother was, of course, infuriated. He went and pursued the case it went to the military police, then it went to court. As soon as the judge found out that the perpetrator was Suleiman al-Assad, something interesting happened there. Namely, the judge argued, well, the car in which the perpetrator was driving, we traced the license plate, and the license plate showed that the car was did not belong to Suleiman al-Assad, so it could not have been him. But of course, the car was stolen, so that didn't make any sense. The judge ultimately threw the case out, and basically, Suleiman was free. And right after the judge threw the case out, Suleiman posted this picture on his Facebook page, and he wrote a comment under it saying, I'm Lord of this country. Anybody has a problem with me, this is my address, this is the village where I live. Now, this is of course interesting because the pro-Assad crowd, the family of the colonel, infuriated. People went to the streets, they demonstrated, of course not for the downfall of the regime, of the government, but for Suleiman Assad to be held accountable. Now, there were a few court cases. Later, the case went to the military court in Damascus. There were a few sessions, but ultimately Suleiman Assad got away with it. And the last thing we heard actually was the photo he posted on his Facebook page of April of this year, is that he was actually at the Syrian consulate in Romania. So this, in a nutshell, it really encapsulates, in a microcosm, the power that these militias have in this country and the fact that they are above the law. And so to understand this and to unpack this a little bit, I'd like to take you a bit on a journey. And I'd like to do three things here. I want to give you a little bit of brief conceptual and historical background into paramilitarism. Second, we'll look at the Syrian paramilitaries in the context of the ongoing conflict. And at the heart of my talk, I will give you examples where we will look in depth into how this phenomenon of these pro-state militias played out in three cities, in Aleppo, in Homs, and in Damascus. Now this project is funded by the Netherlands Organization for Scientific Research. This is the main research council in Holland. And it's part of a broader project. So I wrote a synthetic study, which is basically an overview of paramilitarism more theoretically and conceptually, which is forthcoming now with Oxford University Press. It should be out at some point. And originally in that book, I intended to include a final chapter that was a case study on Syria. But the research became so interesting and it kind of got out of hand, and it grew and it grew. So I decided to make a separate book out of that. So there will be a separate book coming out that focuses especially on Syria. Now there are two PhD students in this project. One who works on Yugoslavia, on Serbian paramilitaries in the Yugoslav wars, and another one on Turkish paramilitaries in the 1990s conflict with the Kurds that is kind of ongoing over there. So this is part of a bigger project. And so paramilitarism obviously needs to be conceptualized here. I define paramilitaries as irregular armed organizations that carry out illegitimate acts of violence against clearly defined civilian individuals or groups. And in this book, and also in these case studies, we look at the rise. How did these things come about? We look at their functioning, at their violence during these conflicts, mostly against civilians, of course. And finally, we look at their aftermath. So what happens when they're demobilized, for example, or are they demobilized? What happened after their after the conflict subsides? Now, there are a range of different literatures that relate to this phenomenon. In particular, social banditry theory. So you might have heard of, obviously, Hobsbawm's book on bandits, in which Hobsbawm argues that these type of groups, these individuals, they're conflict with states. But others, such as the anthropologist Anton Bloch, argues actually no, states and these type of bandits, they work hand in glove very often. And there's a lot of evidence historically that there's collusion between these type of thugs and the state, based on empirical studies. Now, there are a couple of characteristics that are important of these militias. I've listed a few of them here. First of all, they're different from private militias because they these guys are state orchestrated. They're also different from terrorists, because terrorists are generally against the state. These guys fight with the state. Second, the levels of state orchestration varies between, on the one hand, vigilantes come together spontaneously in a particular locale. On the other hand, you have the official special forces, irregular special forces of the state, and a vast gray area in between. And this gray area, I think, is the interesting part. Third, and very importantly, these organizations or groups are very often secretive or covert, but the violence they commit is often very public. And they're interested in, they do that to spread their name, but also this ambiguity, who actually killed these people is an objective, actually, of the state. Fourth, they don't really leave any indication of the legitimate use of force up the hierarchy and the chain of command, so you can't really trace them up within the state, and which of course causes all kinds of discussions on the state monopoly of violence. Let's see, that's fifth, plausible deniability is also a major issue here. A lot of these groups are created to maintain plausible deniability that this, massacres happen, but the state is not involved. And I'll give you a few examples of these. It fits really well into these features. Then there's a very serious issue of organized crime and the involvement of criminals and thugs in a very complex interplay between crime and the state. And finally, I'm also interested in the unintended social, cultural, and political consequences of creating these type of groups and allowing them to commit violence against civilians. Now, if you look at these type of groups, in global history, there are many examples of them. In particular, in 4 major phases. You, of course, have the collapse of the great empires, land empires, the Ottoman Empire, the Habsburg Empire, and the German Empire, also the Romanov Empire. And during those imperial collapses, from the German Freikorps down to the special organization in the Ottoman Empire, these groups functioned during the collapse of states and during the establishment of states. Then, throughout the Cold War, you see paramilitaries and paramilitary forces emerge, especially in Latin America. A lot of them are US funded, so those from Guatemala down to Chile and Argentina, death squads operating in Argentina are pro-state, secretive, covert, and very violent. You also have them in Indonesia and China. I'll give you a few examples in a minute. And then in the 1990s, they make a kind of comeback in some of the European conflicts, but also elsewhere. So in Yugoslavia, you see them in Chechnya. The paramilitary groups that began working in the Chechen civil war became so powerful that the man who's now the president of Chechnya was the head of one of those militias back in the 90s. Right? So the power grew so much, Ramzan Kadyrov, that's his name, is running the country now. And we have, of course, in the 21st century, this is not an old phenomenon that went away. In the 21st century, we see them reemerge in Sudan and in Syria. So to give one example of each of these periods, this is a photo of the special organization. These were the death squads that were responsible for the perpetration of the Armenian genocide. And this is also an interesting kind of point of connection with my previous research, in that when I studied the Armenian genocide, we were looking out for the perpetrators, like who is killing all these people? And they turned out to be this kind of secretive group, not really officially recognized. There were no real photos of them. This is one of the very few photos that we know, taken in front of the war ministry in Istanbul, which also establishes their relationship with the state. And they were very, very influential, actually, in the killings of Armenians. And later, after the Armenian genocide, they went on and they took important positions in the state, in the Turkish state. Then I skipped to Indonesia. So in 1965, in the Indonesian genocide, this genocide was committed largely by the army, but also for a significant part outsourced to certain militias, including a militia called Pancasila, Pemuda Pancasila, which was featured in the famous documentary, The Act of Killing, by Joshua Oppenheimer. Has anyone seen that documentary, by the way? Has anyone not seen that documentary? Please go and watch it. It's an amazing film. It focuses on the gentleman over here. His name is Anwar Congo, and he was a thug, small-time thug. I mean, no spoilers here, but he was a small-time thug And then in 1965, the Indonesian government hired him basically to kill, according to his own saying, about 3,000 so-called communists in that genocide against alleged communists in the city of Medan, in the north of Indonesia. And what you see in that documentary is really interesting. And how is it possible that this petty criminal becomes one of the most powerful men in one of the major cities in Indonesia and gets to commit atrocious violence in one of the biggest genocides in the 20th century? And we're still not done. So in the 1990s, these photos emerged of one of the most notorious paramilitary bosses. This is Arkan Željko Ražnatović. Oh, sorry. He was one of the top, if not the top, Serbian mafia bosses in Yugoslavia. And in 1990, he was basically hired. He was already kind of working for the Yugoslav government, but he was hired to commit a lot of the ethnic cleansing in Croatia first, in Vukovar, and then in Bosnia. So the massacres committed in northern Bosnia, in Bijeljina, for example, him and his paramilitary group, the Tigers, was responsible for a lot of this violence. He was indicted by the Yugoslavia tribunal, but then mysteriously he was assassinated in the Intercontinental Hotel in Belgrade, most likely by Slobodan Milosevic, the president who I think wanted to get rid of the evidence that Arkan might have given to the Yugoslavia tribunal about his involvement with the state. This, by the way, is the only photo in which both Arkan in the back and Milosevic are visible in the same photo. And as you can see from Milosevic's facial expression, he's not very happy with the fact that this guy's behind him, because the point was to create distance with these criminals so that their crimes couldn't be traced back to the state. And finally, in the 21st century, we have the example of the Janjaweed in Sudan, who were mostly responsible. These were militias on horseback, not part of the regular army, not part of the regular police or security services, but they were very, very instrumental in the genocide in Darfur. Most recently, they were also important actually in the repression of demonstrations in Sudan, in the capital Khartoum. So there's a clear global history to this phenomenon. This is not unique, not to the Ottoman Empire, not Indonesia, not Yugoslavia, and not Syria. Syria stands really in a global history that is much broader than the context of the country. Now, when we move now, so I talked a little bit about the concepts and the historical background. When we move into the Syrian case, we clearly see that there are historic models in Syria of these type of strongmen, these type of thugs. And the word that's used in Syrian Arabic is kabadai, which also we use in Turkish, kabadai, which means roughneck. And these are men who, these are these cultural models of masculinity, these roughnecks that roam the cities of Syria, and they dish out social justice, rough justice, kind of like Steven Seagal, but then in the Syrian context, let's say. Now, when you look at the kind of real examples, we have a gentleman here on the left who's called Husni the Savage, who was huge, who was vast, and who had a couple of skeletons in the closet. And every once in a while he would work with the police in Syria in repressing other criminals. So instead of being arrested for his crimes, he was kind of kept on retainer, and every once in a while he was hired, or his business was hired. Now, this also appears in a lot of Syrian television. If you ever watch Syrian television, both in movies and in the series, Syria has a lot of drama series. These type of gentlemen, they always appear. This is a very famous actor who plays in one of the dramas. He plays one of these kabadai in the dramas, and he's in that series. He's a stone cold killer, but he also always has a very sweet cat in his hands, right? So kind of like a roughneck with a heart. And that kind of, those cultural models, they exist in this society. And so when this conflict began, a lot of Syrians, they looked back, or they fell back on these type of models, these type of images. Now, when we look at the Syrian, the apparatus of violence or coercion, what type of state are we talking about? Well, first of all, Syria is a state, government, that commands a really wide range of very, very well-equipped and profoundly trained security apparatus, and very, very security apparatus as well. So it has, I made a partial list of this. So in the red color, there's an army and there's a police. The army for the external security, police for the internal security. But beyond that, there are 2 or 3 important actors. They existed way before this conflict as well, that had an important impact in this society. First of all, the bullet points in green, they are the intelligence services. So Syria has up to 17 different intelligence services, all of whom are armed to the teeth, all of whom have their own prisons, all of whom have the right, they have license to kill these agents, they have license to arrest anybody without due process. So they're incredibly powerful in this, totalitarian society. Now beyond that, there are 3 major, in the blue bullet points, 3 major special forces. The 4th Armored Brigade, which is run by President Assad's brother, this guy, Assad. Then the Republican Guard, who are these very well-trained special ops. And then we have the special forces. So we're talking about tens of thousands of men under arms to surveil this society and to form a threat. And when the conflict began in Syria, it was this apparatus of violence that was unleashed on a population that went out and demonstrated massively in the streets as part of the Arab Spring. Now, all of these groups are interesting to study. But what I'm interested in are not per se these groups, but militias that the Assad regime created in 2011 to repress these demonstrations. And these militias are called Shabbiha, these paramilitaries. So they exist outside of these structures, although they have relations with various of these groups. Now, Shabbiha means ghosts in Syrian Arabic. And these are, stereotypically men like this, who, roughnecks, who showed up in 2011 in the streets of Syria, irregular, armed, didn't really have uniforms. It was unclear for who they worked, but they were very thuggish. They stormed demonstrations and neighborhoods. They committed arrests. They repressed these demonstrations, shooting, for example, with live bullets at demonstrations, as well as other property crimes, torture, kidnapping, sexual violence, and by the end of 2011, early 2012, also some very serious massacres in civilian areas. Now, what is interesting is that they targeted especially the civilian support for this uprising. Even as the uprising militarized, and there were rebel groups, the Free Syrian Army and other groups came up. These groups, these Shabbiha groups, they always targeted the civilian support networks. And their crimes are fairly well documented. And so the question I'm asking in this book is how and why did these men get involved in this violence? What type of guys are we talking about? And how did they experience the conflict? Because in the media there was a lot of kind of mystification. These kind of evil guys pumped up with steroids, and there was no attempt made really to understand these perpetrators. And since I work more or less in perpetrator studies, I'm interested in the motives of perpetrators and in the violence they commit and what that violence means to them. Now, 2011 went by more or less with mass demonstrations by hundreds of thousands of Syrians on the one hand, and Shabbiha frantically repressing these demonstrations. By early 2012, as the uprising militarized and people started shooting back at the government, so too did the Shabbiha. And they became a little bit more, they started looking like this a little bit more. So partly because of intervention by Iran, they transformed the Shabbiha and they gave them an official name, the National Defense Forces, Al-Quwat al-Difa al-Watani in Arabic. And this had a couple of consequences. It formalized their structures. So they used to be very informal, just a couple of guys hanging on a corner bearing arms, and they became more formalized. It also devolved state power. So by giving them heavier weapons and more responsibility, they gathered much more power at the local level. And it also further, as a result of this empowerment, it further criminalized the conflict. And the latest incident of NDF violence was the Suleiman Assad example that I gave you in the beginning of my talk, because it showed that they didn't even listen to their patrons anymore. So the state created them, and then, in a way, actually, they became too big and too powerful for the state to withdraw them, or to repress them, or demobilize them. How do you research something like this that doesn't want to be researched? Because there are very clear limits, of course. You can't just walk into a neighborhood in Damascus, walk up to these guys and point the microphone and say, guys, how did you get involved in this violence? So you will end up 6 feet deep. And there are examples of people who've tried and they ended 6 feet deep, which also means that the sources that we have to work with require a separate discussion. And I could give a whole talk about methodology, actually, of how to study these type of groups. I'm not going to do that, but I want to say a few things of it. Namely, there are also possibilities, because we are living in the age of one of these smartphones. These guys also have smartphones, and their victims and their survivors also have smartphones. And everybody's taking videos and pictures, and a lot of these guys have Facebook profiles. And I'll show you an example in a minute. So you can actually gather a lot from social media. What was, for example, not possible in the 1960s or even in the 1990s. And so if you look at all this material, all this data, from Facebook, from YouTube, from anywhere, it really allows us to get a certain insight into their functioning. To give an example of the YouTube business, so if you type in Arabic Shabbiha in YouTube, or even in English, then you get tens of thousands of hits. And according to a friend of mine who works on YouTube documentation of the Syrian conflict, this is an NGO called Syrian Archive. They are based in Berlin. And he argued that if you add up all of these videos, and if you would watch all these videos on Syria back to back, that would be like 4 or 5 times the actual duration of the conflict. Right? So it would take a lifetime actually to look at all these videos. And so that's not possible, so we need to develop other digital ways actually of studying this phenomenon. Now, apart from social media, let me just give you an example of this actually, while we're at it. So here you can just basically type in Arabic, National Defense Forces, and I'm now going to the National Defense Forces of Homs. You just click on them, and they have photos, and this is in Dutch, by the way, sorry for that. And they post things every once in a while. They post photos like this, in which they sometimes tag people, but they always have comments, and somebody else comments on it. So this is an incredible wealth of information, in that what would normally not be possible is these people are producing these sources, so we can look at them. And I have, and I want you to take a look at this gentleman over here, in the middle, with the beard and the salt and pepper hair. Okay, he's going to come back. A different example are these type of groups when they post photos and videos. What this offers very often is so names. You can verify a lot of individuals who are at certain places. You can get a lot of material from their perspective and their experience of certain acts of violence. You get, of course, names. For example, there are names of people who died, who passed away in various ways. So apart from the kind of the bread and butter of, let's say, historical work, you also get a lot of interpretations of things. Of course, there are always propaganda photos. This is an interesting one, for example, in which Assad is visiting one of these groups. So that means that you cannot, as a government, argue that you didn't know these groups existed and you didn't know what type of violence they were committing, right? Different example. There are also individual profiles. All of this is public, by the way. And so I'm not disclosing anything that's, for example, confidential information. Just type it in YouTube, in Facebook, and you can just get there. A lot of these guys, they just have their own profiles. And on their profiles, they post pictures of their children and their family, and every once in a while, they post videos. And so this is an incredible wealth of information. You also see things about their kind of religious beliefs. This is memories, I guess. So it's kind of interesting to look at the Facebook pages of these militias. Now, apart from Facebook, There are also a lot of videos on YouTube that you can look at. And I want to take a look at one of these that somebody, I don't know who, but somebody videotaped a Shabbiha checkpoint secretly with their smartphone by basically turning on the video function and then holding the phone in their hands and then just walking by and secretly filming. Because filming them is obviously prohibited. It could be potentially deadly. But what we see here is something interesting. Let's take a look. This is in Damascus. So you see this gentleman over here. Now he's going to walk by. That's a taxi. And here is the checkpoint. As you can see, men in civilian clothes with AK-47s, stopping cars, and sometimes taking out people, and, well, robbing people. That also happens a lot. You see that? Sometimes they have rudimentary military clothing. Depends a little bit on which year the video is taken from. And so this gives us a good sense of, for example, where checkpoints are. Because if you are Damascene and you look at this video, you immediately know where this is. So what we can do actually is we can look at this video, verify the individuals that are in this video, and we can ask people who lived in that neighborhood, who went through that checkpoint, to ask them what type of experiences they had. You know, how violent were these people towards you? What did they do to you? And things like that. So that corroboration is possible only by putting all these pieces of the puzzle together. There are also a lot of violent videos. I'm not going to show any. I just want to let you know that I've watched perhaps thousands of these, in which either somebody is secretly filming Shabbiha committing violence, or there are leaked videos of Shabbiha actually documenting their own violence, in which they are, for example, sometimes killing people, executing people, sometimes torturing people, or in various other ways destroying, burning their houses, etc., or raiding neighborhoods. I'm not going to show the video, but we see here somebody, gentleman on the left, very clearly Shabbiha, informal t-shirt on, sunglasses, tattoos, military hat. He arrested somebody and he's beating the crap out of the guy. And there are many of these type of examples. So, and this is interesting because when we study perpetrators, there are actually very few either descriptions and certainly not videos of how this violence is committed by this gentleman. Very often we have to rely on survivors, we have to rely on their episodic memory, but actually by having all of these videos, it's almost a blessing actually for perpetrator studies, because we can see their actions as they play out. So I use a lot of these materials in my research, and I supplement that with immersive ethnography and interviews to paint a composite picture. So on the one hand, I use perpetrator data, what I just showed you, including interviews with perpetrators, and on the other hand, I use materials from survivors and from victims, bottom up. And when we look and when we corroborate, then we see, then we can actually paint a picture of certain massacres that's much more reliable than some of these like media articles that showed up and that popped up and said, well, something terrible happened in that village. And then they move on to the next village or to the next massacre. So by slowing down and focusing, we actually have a chance of painting either the line from inside out and from outside in. With that patchwork, actually, it gives you a very interesting picture of, actually gives you a collective biography of a generation of men, of boys, actually, who became men in this conflict, and we learn about their motives and their experiences, actually, of a whole generation. So these photos are all taken from Facebook pages of Shabbiha. Obviously, sometimes I try to friend them on Facebook. Mostly they just reject, and sometimes they just post their own stuff publicly, which is of course a little strange, but of course I grab it and then I use it in research. Now, what we see here is really a generational phenomenon. A whole generation of men who were in their early 20s in 2011, So they were born around the year 1990, more or less. Let's say between 1985, 1980 and 1995. So these are millennials who were empowered in this conflict, and many of them signed up with the Shabbiha and committed immense violence. And I'm also interested in studying their afterlives. So when you keep following their Facebook pages, or you keep following their lives, the course of their existence, then you see actually that some of them, they stay in Syria and others move to Europe under the radar and with the great refugee waves that we saw in 2015. And some of these people, they keep posting things on Facebook. And one of these guys I also spoke to, and I'll give you an example in a minute. Now, let me get to the core of my talk. So in the next, 15 minutes more or less, I will talk a little bit about how we can unpack Shabbiha violence in Syria. Now, first and foremost, we need to dispel this myth that these are only thuggish, Alawite men from the countryside who pumped up with steroids. So this stereotypical image we can throw out of the window. Shabbiha is a very diverse phenomenon, and you can see that in 3 cities that I examined. In 3 cities, there were similar forms of violence against civilians, but the pathways towards that violence was very different. Namely, in Aleppo, we see tribalization. In Homs, we see sectarianization, sectarian violence. And in Damascus, we see clientelization, so clientelism as an important catalyst, actually, of Shabbiha violence. So let's start with Aleppo. Now, the city of Aleppo, in the north of Syria, is a city that became split across political lines. So, in the western Aleppo, the red zone was under the rule of Assad, the green zone was under the rule of the rebels, and that continued for quite a while. But before that, in 2011, demonstrations began, especially in the green areas, as well as at the University of Aleppo. The students, there were about 100,000 students at the University of Aleppo. Almost all of them went to the streets and demonstrated against the regime. The green dot in western Aleppo is where the university is. Now, what we saw in 2011 is that those Shabbiha, those militias that went into these green neighborhoods and committed these massacres and committed this violence were mostly drawn from a tribal group from the Berri family. The Berri family are a Sunni tribe from southeastern Aleppo, and they stormed the demonstrations and committed violence against civilians. They also stormed the university. So there are many videos actually of the students demonstrating and then the Shabbiha coming in and destroying and killing students during the demonstrations. And when we look at their identities, they are, almost all of them actually, they work under this tribe whose chieftain is this gentleman. This one. And he is, his name is Zaino Berri. He was the tribal chieftain, head of the tribe. And under his command were possibly thousands of armed men. And he derived his power from the fact that he was a member of parliament in Syria. Here he is in one of the meetings with Assad before the conflict. And he mobilized his Shabbiha in 2011, probably when the government asked him, and they then committed all this violence in Syria. Now, Aleppo at some point almost fell to the rebels. In this period that the rebels were very strong, the rebels managed actually to kidnap him and some of his bodyguards. And so, a little trigger warning here, the photo is a little bit graphic. The rebels in July 2012 kidnapped him and executed him publicly in one of the neighborhoods in Aleppo. The tribe was then, power in the tribe went to the next person in command, and that person we interviewed in this project, and we asked him actually how he felt about all of this violence and what was his interpretation actually of the conflict. And that's going to be an interesting chapter in the book. Now, we move on to the city of Homs. I think this is my favorite case, not only because it's a city that I was quite familiar with before the conflict. I went there a couple of times. I had a lot of friends from that city. We see a very different picture. And Homs was a very segmented city. it was a city that was mostly Sunni and Christian, and Alawites, so this is the religious minority that Assad is from, they were mostly living in the countryside in the west of Syria. And in the 1970s, they all kind of descended from their villages, and they all came and lived, almost all of them, in these neighborhoods. So Zahra in the north, Akrama, Karma Loz, and Wadi Dahab. And as Alawites came in, a lot of them, of course, they became very powerful under the Assad regime, which was a heavily Alawite regime, not exclusively, but heavily. And when the revolution, or the uprising began in 2011, it was these neighborhoods that Assad, that the Shabbiha came from, and committed violence on these red neighborhoods that were protesting almost daily and became opposition strongholds. Now, in 2011 and 12, there were several very important massacres committed, large-scale massacres committed in these red neighborhoods, especially here in Babahan, in the north, in Khaldia, Dayada, Deir Barber, and also actually the Karamazir. Now these massacres, they dominated the news in 2012. If you go back to the news in the first half of 2012, massacre in Homs, massacre in Homs, massacre in Homs. But who was committing these massacres? It was relatively unclear. Also, who was running the Shabbiha in the city was also relatively unclear. And it took me years to uncover that it was a relatively obscure man by the name of Saqqar Rustam, who was responsible for organizing the NDF, the Shabbiha, because his uncle was an important general who worked in the palace with President Assad. So these guys were mobilized through personal connections, personal ties. Because before the conflict, he was a businessman, and he was a failing businessman. But the conflict gave him enormous opportunities to make himself important again by mobilizing young men, putting them under arms, and committing violence that the government thought was useful. Now, the massacres that his Shabbiha committed in Homs were mostly in these opposition neighborhoods that I told you, and it is from the pro-regime neighborhoods that we took a lot of interviews with men that worked for him. It was impossible to interview him. We contacted him once, and he immediately realized that this was a setup, or this Western people, they want something from me. So he was aware, or he knew that we knew that he knew that something criminal or something violent was going on. So he absolutely was aware, highly intelligent, didn't give anything away. So no interviews with Saqqar Rustam. There are also no interviews in the Syrian media with him, which also is very interesting. Because in this conflict, almost anybody and everybody held a gun, stepped forward and went into the limelight, into the cameras, and argued that they were very important to this conflict, and I saved the country, and I'm very important, and I'm a war hero. He stayed out of the limelight. There are no interviews with him. So what we have about him is patchwork from people who worked for him. And the massacres that his men committed were very, very serious. Kidnappings, taking detainees, and so the photos are too gruesome really to show them here, but the aftermaths of these massacres, they always produce two visuals. So as soon as something, massacre happened, there was only two visuals. The survivors posted pictures like this and videos like this. Sorry. Survivors posted pictures like this, mass graves, and we're dealing with always 50 plus people killed in neighborhoods that made a major impact. In some cases, of entire extended families were killed, actually, because people lived together, often in the same building, or they are neighbors. And Shabbiha would go into these neighborhoods, they would basically kill everybody, including children, infants, and babies. And there are pictures of this as well. And that poses also a problem, not just moralizing here, like, oh, they're baby killers, but no, I mean, like, what type of threshold, moral threshold, do you as a human being have to cross to commit this type of violence so quickly into the conflict? And so that was one visual. These type of pictures that came out a lot. They also went to the media and to the BBC and Al Jazeera. But from the regime side, different pictures came out. More triumphant pictures came out. So here's a picture of, remember this guy? Abu Yaqub. This is our good friend, Muhammad Ali Nasser. But these perpetrators, they always work with nicknames. So his nickname is Abu Yaqub, father of Jacob. His son is called Yaqub. And he posted these type of pictures triumphantly after these massacres. And you can see in the background that the neighborhood is kind of destroyed. There's another picture in which they are standing in front of a in front of a burnt down building. And these are kind of trophies. These are selfies, because millennials, they take selfies, of men who committed the massacre, and they were kind of proud of what they had done. So this was important for them to document that we were there, we rescued the nation, quote unquote. These would be the quotes under these posts. And they were quite open about it. So you could follow them and you can actually grab this material online. Now, by the year 2014-15, the city of Homs gradually came into the hands of Assad again. These pockets, opposition pockets with rebels, they were rooted out, and Assad started controlling the city. Which means these guys became very important, and they began ruling the city. They started having an impact in the economy, in governance. One of them ran for office of governor. Didn't work, but he tried. So these people who were actually, before the conflicts, they were nobodies, became quite important. And maybe the conflict was the best thing that ever happened to them. Because if had there been no conflict in Syria, then they might have been maybe selling vegetables in the market. Who knows? So this is a form of social mobility for these guys. Now, after 2015, something bizarre happened. Abu Yaqub got killed in 2017. And everybody was thinking, how the hell is this possible? Because this was a period in which the NDF and the Shabbiha, they were lord and master of Homs. So, and the regime media argued that it was terrorists who had killed him. But we interviewed some of these people around him, including his brother, and it turns out actually that it was a product of infighting in the Shabbiha as they took over the whole city and became so powerful. There was a lot more to gain, but also a lot more to lose for them. So what happened is that our friend Saqqa Rustam, the head of the Shabbiha, was jealous of the gentleman on the right, Khaldoun Abu Ali, who was a kind of runner-up in Shabbiha in Homs, and to send a message to Khaldoun Abu Ali, killed his bodyguard, who was Abu Yaqub. Right? So, very interesting. I mean, I went to the Facebook page of Abu Yaqub in his village, and all the messages under it would say, God rest his soul, he was a martyr for the cause, terrorists go to hell, etc., etc. And nobody said it was actually Saqqa Rustam who killed him, he's one of us. And just as a joke, I thought I should write that in Arabic, but I probably shouldn't do that and get in trouble there. But, so this kind of posed the problem of infighting. Now, how were the NDF, how was the Shabbiha connected to the regime, to the government? How did they take their orders? How were they embedded in the state structures? Very difficult to tell, but we have somewhat of an idea, patchy idea in some areas. And I think this picture really sums it up really well. Because here you see a bunch of men in uniforms in a triumphant photo taken from the Twitter channel of the Syrian Arab Armed Forces, so the army. And what you see here is something really interesting. If you zoom in to these three gentlemen on the left, then you see here three persons who are fascinating. This man, with the black fleets, I guess, is Jamil Hassan. Jamil Hassan is head of the Air Force Intelligence, which is the most powerful and probably the most brutal of all of these intelligence forces, the green bullet points. The man standing to his left, in slightly different camouflage color, is a man called Suhail al-Hassan, who, not related, is the head of the Tiger Forces. He's one of the special forces, head of one of the special forces. The slightly chubby man standing to his left, with his chest open, is one of the top Shabbiha from the city of Homs, who, before the conflict, was a kind of professional criminal. He was quite important in the smuggling of drugs and arms, kidnapping rings and things like that, and he was actually in jail in 2011. So when the uprising began, he was in prison for property crimes, for private crimes. In 2011, when the conflict began, what happened, you can guess, that gentleman, Ali al-Shilli, Ali comes out of prison because of a deal that he makes with the government, in that if we offer you a deal, you get out of prison, you go to these demonstrating neighborhoods, you commit the violence we think is important, we'll let you out, we'll clear your record. And that's what happens. And here we have a little bit of a success in that, to find out a little bit more about him, we just contacted him and we interviewed him through Skype. Now, this criminal past and this amnesty is something that we found out by interviewing him, something that we didn't know. Another interesting thing is that he considers the conflict in purely sectarian terms. He sees this as an existential fight between Sunnis, Sunni Muslim, and Alawites. And if you ask him about his worldview, he sees the entire conflict stuck in between two phases. He has resentment of the past, in which Alawites were minorities and they were oppressed, that's all true. And fear of the future, in which, well, if this uprising becomes successful, we might become a minority again, and we might have to suffer again. So he's stuck between these two kind of temporal positions. He runs a very famous kidnapping ring, and also a private prison, actually, in his house. So behind his house, in his village, he has a prison where he just kidnaps people, and he lets them out for ransom. And he openly also said, this is a quote, "Of course I kidnapped and killed perhaps more than 300 people." Now, Ali Shili became a bit of a nuisance, in that he started kidnapping people who were like children of Syrian businessmen who worked with Assad. So these businessmen would complain, of course, to Assad, "Look, this guy is bothering us, do something about it." So finally, Assad sends his intelligence forces, arrests him, and he was sentenced to the death penalty in December 2018. We interviewed him in January. Right after that, he even, on Skype, he even showed us the death sentence. He took a screen grab and then he put it down again. But the interesting thing is that he's still free. So something bizarre is going on. Forget about the violence he committed against the opposition. He commits violence against communities that support Assad, and he still gets away with it. And I think that shows the power and the networks and the connections that these type of people have with top brass. And that's why I show that picture with those three guys next to each other. Now, one of his victims was this gentleman, Ayman, who agreed that I share his photo because there's a video of his release from Ali Shili's prison. And this is what he said when we interviewed him. At 3 o'clock at night, the Shabbiha of Ali Shili broke down our door and stormed our house. They stole all the furniture, they took us to their camp and beat us really hard. Ali Shili personally shot at people's legs. Then they put me in solitary confinement, Munfarida. But the solitary here is not the same as the regime. I was in a military intelligence prison before, but at least they had bathrooms and some food. At Ali Shili's prison, there was no food, nothing. It was worse. I stayed 25 days. They began torturing me and broke my leg. My family arranged the ransom of 4 million Syrian lira. So 500 Syrian lira was $1. I stayed in Turkey for a year to receive treatment, and now he's out in Turkey. And he actually wants the story to be out. He wants the crimes to be exposed. So we actually benefited from the fact that we have a survivor here who wants to speak out. Because we also interviewed people who said, well, this is what I went through, but please don't write anything down. Because even if they're outside the country, even if they're in Germany, a lot of them are still terrified for the power and the wrath of these type of men. Yeah? Okay. Final case, Damascus, before I close. Now, Damascus is a profoundly complex story. But in essence, it is about suppressing the demonstrations in, again, these red areas, the poor suburbs of Damascus that were mostly Sunni Arabs, who came into the city in the 1970s and 80s and became the underclass, really kind of working class and underclass, impoverished people who went to the streets in 2011 and demonstrated massively. Now, there's definitely sectarianism going on here, in that there were definitely Christian militias and Alawite militias and Shiite militias who went to these Sunni areas and committed sectarian violence. But I think the core of the issue is not in the sectarianism. I think it is a much broader problem. And it has to do, I think, with clientelization. The uprising revived and militarized patron-client relations. So Syria is a country in which patron-client relations is very important. You want to get anything done, you need a patron. right? So you want to build out your house, or you want to go have an operation at the hospital, anything you want to do, you need some networks, you need personal contacts. And these networks became mobilized, and they mobilized generally around sects, but also across sects. So here's a picture of one of the Shabbiha from Damascus, whose story is a little bit more complex, because he, the gentleman on the left, so these are the same people, with the biceps, he he is a Sunni background individual, but his best friend was the gentleman on the right, in the camouflage pants, who was Alawite. Now when the conflict began, what happened is that the Alawite buddy asked his Sunni buddy for a favor. And the favor was, we have a problem, there's an existential threat to the regime, and we need to bear some arms and go, pardon my language, kick some ass. And so he did. He did mobilize. And then he started posting things on his Facebook, such as these pictures. So that's the same Alawite buddy over there. This is him on the right. And this, if you upload this to Facebook, this is an unmistakable message to Syrians that you mean business. This is a very threatening picture, because as you can see from the wall, there's pictures of Assad, a little bit too many, and he's flipping through some files. So I think this is a threat in that I am in the intelligence branches, in one of the intelligence branches. I'm working with the secret police, don't mess with me. So it's a kind of projection of power. Then there's some quiet. There's like in the year 2020, from 2014 on, there's some quiet, and in 2016, all of a sudden, he posted a picture like this. And I saw the photo and I was like, wait a minute, you see the license plate on the car? The yellow license plate is the Netherlands. And even in the left corner, in the blue section, it says NL. So I realized this guy is in Holland now. So that's kind of interesting. So then you get this photo. This is all from his Instagram account, by the way, which I started following. And there's a lot of selfies of him, with no shirt and kind of showing off his muscles, or he's at the beach, or he's chilling with his buddies. So, millennials, again, take 10 selfies a day. And then I wrote to him on Facebook. I gathered my kind of courage. I thought, okay, we're in a slightly safer environment, although I was still a little bit, let's say, fearful a bit. And I contacted him. And he turned out to be very friendly. And he said, shall we meet for a coffee? I said, why not?
Did you, if I may, did you make the contact in Arabic or in Nederlands?
In Arabic. I contacted him in Arabic, and he turned out that he had been in Holland already for almost a year, and his Dutch was decent. Could have a conversation with the guy. He also spoke English, and he would kind of mix languages depending on how he felt. And so I had a coffee with him, and then he invited me to his house. And this is when it got kind of interesting, because I went to his house, and we had a chat, and when I walked in, this dog, by the way, Staffordshire Terrier, was at the door. So I walk in, and this dog kind of got up, and he was like this big, and he looked at me, and he started growling, and I was like, oh, this dog knows what research I'm doing. So I thought, this is not going too well. But he was very friendly, and it was, out of his context. So we sat down and we had a drink and we talked for quite a while. And I kind of got to his motives, like his explanations of the conflict. I asked him, why do you think this conflict began? And he had a narrative. And I asked him, and he showed me the photos. He showed me other photos of him bearing arms. And I asked him, why did you pick up arms? And then he told me the story about wasta. Wasta in Arabic, Syrian Arabic, means connections. He said, I needed connections. It's not because I hated the opposition. It's not because I wanted to go out and kill everybody for Assad. I don't even love Assad, he said. But I needed the connections, and my buddy could secure them for me. So he went out, and then later, what is also very interesting is, I asked him if he didn't get in trouble with these Facebook photos. And he said, you know what, when I came to Holland, in the refugee camp, one of the guys recognized me. One of the guys from Damascus, not Syrian, recognized me. He fingered me, and he went to the police, showing the pictures that I was bearing arms. Because if you were a combatant in Syria, you can't get asylum status in Europe. You have to declare that. And he didn't. So the police came, arrested him. He was arraigned for a judge. And then something very interesting happened. The judge threw out the case because he said the gentleman wasn't wearing any insignia. There were no military insignia on his shoulders, so therefore we couldn't tie him to any group. And I heard that, and I was like, wow, well, that was exactly the point of Shabbiha, is to create these type of armed groups that were ambiguous, ambivalent, and that could commit violence and could not be traced back to the state. And so he totally got away with it scot-free, and every once in a while he calls me whether I want to have a beer with him. Now, my conclusions. Now, first and foremost, we need to realize that Shabbiha is a very diverse phenomenon. In Aleppo, we're dealing with a different dynamic with tribal groups. In Homs, we're dealing indeed with sectarianism, and in Damascus with clientelism. As we can also tell from other examples than just this one I gave. The violence went across three cleavages. There was Shabbiha violence against opposition civilians in these massacres, Shabbiha violence against loyalist civilians in the kidnappings by Ali Shilli, and Shabbiha violence between each other. So against each other, they could also be quite brutal and quite violent. Now, these type of militias, I think, served four important objectives. First of all, they were a force multiplier, a very basic argument of raising the numbers of armed men for the state. Second, they offered a facade of popular support. So because they were irregular and civilian, the government could say, it's not us arming them, look, people love the government, so that's why they're up in arms. As if it's so easy to get an AK-47. Third, plausible deniability is also very important. The government can disavow any linkage with these groups. And this we also see in some of the interviews given by Syrian government officials, including diplomats, who literally would say, we regret these massacres going on, but unfortunately we have no idea who these people are. And that is a very old chestnut, actually, because that was also in some of these other previous examples of paramilitarism in Yugoslavia and in Rwanda and also in Indonesia. That was a time-tested argument, actually. And finally, these groups are also, I think, it's one of my arguments, they're established by government to spread complicity for the crimes that they commit, for the violence that they commit, which means that they are irreversibly tied to the government from then on, from that violence. Because they burn bridges with these communities, with these victim communities. They draw new social boundaries in society. And so eminently, paramilitarism is not only about giving weapons to some guys to go kill somebody else, but it's also about social engineering. It's also about drawing new lines of loyalty and disloyalty, of useful citizens and of expendable citizens. And finally, obviously, paramilitarism also has problems. The fragmentation of the security apparatus. So beginning last year, the first, and you could have seen this coming from a mile, the first clashes between Shabbiha and the Syrian police began. Because at some point they really got they started getting out of control. And then the Assad regime would send its security forces, and the Shabbiha were like, no, we're not giving up our weapons, actually. And there were serious skirmishes between them. And then so Assad had to send special forces to go and really disarm them or negotiate with them. And so it was a bit of a nightmare as well. Second, also the devolution of power was a major issue. At the height of Shabbiha power in 2015, you could go from different city to city to city, and you would have to kind of demonstrate loyalty to whoever was in charge right there. You couldn't go with just a pass, signed by the military police and travel through the country. No, you would have to find out who was the Shabbiha boss in this country. You would have to call his buddies and say, well, sir, I'm passing through, is that okay? And then he would have to call his checkpoint so you can pass through. This is how much power they had at the local level. And finally, it also profoundly criminalized the economy of Syria. These people started smuggling and commodifying almost anything, from movement, so the checkpoints became a way to extort people, to they started getting into the legal economy. The vegetable market in Homs, for example, is now run by Shabbiha. Some of these old criminals, they started extorting, and in some cases kidnapping and killing owners of hotels, taking over the hotels. One of them actually set up a hospital. So we're dealing with an oil stain that really gradually, it was supposed to stay in a particular space in Syrian society, gradually took over other elements and other sectors of the country. I think that this is roughly where we are right now in 2019. Thank you for your attention. If there are any questions, I'm of course happy to answer them. Yeah, go ahead.
To what extent is plausible deniability still a reason for governments doing this if it can so easily be traced back to that government?
Mm-hmm. It's a good question. So to what extent is plausible deniability credible? Because, you know, if as an academic, I can kind of disentangle this web of plausible deniability, then you can bet that intelligence services or the criminal tribunals, for example, who have many more resources than we do, can also do that, obviously. I think that's a difficult question. I mean, if you look at a different example, so Serbia during the wars of the 1990s, then there are a couple of examples of journalists and diplomats who confronted Milosevic with crimes of his paramilitary groups. And he said, look, we established that this head of this paramilitary group was working with your intelligence agencies. You know, here are the pay slips. They would show pay slips, like this guy got paid, here are the, and Milosevic would say, well, that happened out of my control. And thank you for letting me know, and I'll make sure that I'll resolve the issue. And of course, what they did is they just sharpened Milosevic's tools of hiding those connections and hiding those violence. Because as soon as that journalist or the diplomat left the room, Milosevic picked up the phone, called his guys from the intelligence and said, you idiots, no more pay slips, of course. Don't put anything on paper. So the more you expose plausible deniability, the more sophisticated this infrastructure of hiding violence becomes. And we saw that example in Yugoslavia, and in Syria it's not very different actually. Yeah, other questions? Manu?
What do you think the role is, or what, I know it's totally different, well it's similar topic, but what's the role of the Shabbiha in the more newly occupied or taken over, whatever word you want to use, in the eastern part towards the desert?
Yeah.
Where it was ISIS controlled.
Yes.
When Assad came in, what was the role of Shabbiha there, where they've already lost control of this vast region for many number of years? Yeah.
Okay, he's asking, what is the role of Shabbiha in territories that were lost by Assad during the course of the war? Well, there are two things that are important here. One is, at some point between 2011 and 2015, the power that Assad had, the territorial control he had, contracted. It contracted, which means that in the territories that he still did control, which was the most populous part of Syria, right? Because eastern Syria is mostly desert. There are two cities, Deir ez-Zor and Raqqa, they're not very populous. And so, in the cities he still had control. There, these people were profoundly powerful. In those areas where, before losing control, there were Shabbiha bosses and Shabbiha groups. As soon as rebels came in, for example, or ISIS came in, or another group, anti-Assad group came in, these Shabbiha groups, individuals, if people knew who they were arrested and executed in some cases. In other cases, they knew they were going to be executed or they were going to be killed or had to fight, so they fled to government-held Syria. And what happened is that it left basically these lost territories open to other groups to take local power. That's one element. The second element is it's puzzling, but for those of you who are interested in studying local dynamics of violence, it's actually not that puzzling, in that tribal groups such as this one. So this is the Berri tribe. It's one of dozens of Arab tribes in Syria. These guys were very close with the government. There were others that weren't really very close with the government, but also weren't really close with the rebels. And these type of neutral, more or less neutral Arab tribes, they began working with whoever was in charge in that city at that time. Right? So Raqqa is a very good example. Right? The erstwhile capital of the ISIS caliphate, quote unquote. So one of the tribes that's very prominent in Raqqa, when Assad was in control, they worked with Assad. And then Assad lost, ISIS came in, they started working with ISIS. You know, they just grew some beards and, you know, threw out a couple of Allahu Akbars. And they were basically, they joined ISIS. Simple as that. And ISIS was fine with that. I think ISIS, deep in their hearts, really knew that these guys were not really fundamentalist Muslims. But they were useful, because this is a tribe, thousands of men, a lot of territory that they control, and it's a useful resource to have. Now, as ISIS lost territory, the Kurds came in and took the territory, took Raqqa. These tribes, as you can guess, started working with the Kurds. Just shaved off their beards and started talking about brotherhood between Kurds and Arabs and things like that. So a lot of them were also quite opportunistic in whoever was in charge, wherever the wind blows, you know, we kind of work with them. And that's a survival mechanism for these tribes. Because if you throw in your lot with one group, and the others came in and they know that you worked against them, then you're of course in trouble. Survival of the tribe is more important than commitment, ideological commitments. Wolf.
You explained very briefly when you talked about the motives that it was not about, let's say, being explicitly pro-regime or pro-Assad. It can have so many other kind of layers, right? And I was wondering, because this confirms a little bit like studies also during the Holocaust, that people, when they are offered, let's say, possible social advantages, reputation, careers, that this is very attractive to people and can change their lives, and that's what makes them very loyal. They don't need the ideology for them. So this spoke a little bit to this. Can you tell something about, let's say, personal gain? Because you talked about families, and then there was this one picture with the BMW. So is this also in a way not just for careers, but also for really gain wealth?
Mm-hmm. So when we look at political violence, violence that's motivated or that is committed in a conflict that's, you know, mostly political, it's over ideology or it's over political motives. It doesn't mean that every single actor, of course, only acts out of political motives or exclusively out of political motives. Very often it's a combination of private and political. And if we zoom in on those private motives, we clearly see, so as I said, wasta is a very important word in Arabic, actually. It means connections. It's very important. Personal gain, for example, we're looking at economic gain, is very important. And being in these militias and getting impunity, you know, to go into these neighborhoods, like this one, for example. It's a very good example of these guys who really weren't well educated, and under normal conditions, they wouldn't really be very prominent in Syria. At best, they would have kind of pretty, dead-end jobs, maybe working in an office, maybe selling vegetables, but not very prominent. And now, by joining these militias and committing this violence, not only did they gain less immaterially they gain pride, power, connections. You know, their importance rose dramatically in Syria, but also materially. So a lot of them got quite rich because the government allowed them to loot opposition neighborhoods. So there are a couple of videos out there in which they're filming it themselves. They enter these apartments. Of course, the residents, terrified, have fled. They enter these apartments and they just unplug the television. They take the fridge. They take the washing machines. They strip anything and everything of this house and they take it with them. And they either sell it secondhand or they keep it or whatever. In some cases, and that's why I showed the checkpoint. I mean, the checkpoint economy is fascinating. Syrians have been extorted massively at checkpoints. You would go through a checkpoint, you would give your ID, because normally they're supposed to check your ID, you're not wanted, they let you go. But a lot of people came into checkpoints, they gave their ID, and then their arms were caught in the air, like, that's a nice watch. You know, it's my birthday today, so why don't you hand it over to me, right? And good luck if you want to reject that, because then your name all of a sudden is on the list. So robbing people, there are examples of people having to give up their title deeds of their houses at checkpoints. People being robbed of the title deeds, imagine that. So you can't even legally prove, if you go to a court, you can't even legally prove it's your house, because the Shabbiha just shows up and says, wait a minute, you know, he uses what is this thing, the Sharpie. He uses the Sharpie, blots out the guy's name, writes his name under it, and it's my house now. And the same thing you can argue for like shops, factories. So the predatory way in which the Shabbiha went into their own society, into their own population, and extorted them and robbed them is really unprecedented. So this is also something that was interesting to me, in that, so Mehmet and I, we wrote a book on confiscation of Armenian property in the genocide. And I was talking with him a lot about during the conflict in Syria, and I told him, you know, a lot of these things are actually happening in Syria as well. For example, if you would have one member in your family who was known as an member of the opposition, then the Assad regime would expropriate the entire family. So there's a law, actually, law number 10, that says that those people who were active in opposition are expropriated. So whatever you own belongs to the state now, and the state, what does the state do with it? They distribute it to loyalists, including these type of guys. Right? And especially because they could make the argument, look at us, we're in arms for the state, you know? Something's got to give, no? And they felt that this robbing and this plunder also, it legitimized, or it was they legitimized the plunder by arguing that they were putting their lives on the line for the country. So this private gain, extremely important, and I think it requires really a separate study on the massive property transfer and wealth transfer that occurred in this conflict. Yes?
You said that people are turning up in the Netherlands, they're turning up, of course, in Germany and in Turkey, and even in Canada, Australia, and even here. So there are so many actors, for those of us who are not professionally 24/7 reading these things, even those of us who are moderately well-read, know that there are so many actors in such a small country. Russia's in there, Iran is there, we're there, America is there, Turkey is there, Kurds are there, and the militias that you say. So is there anybody who you could say is, and there are local people who have worked for all of these groups or certain of these groups, in a country that is so small, do you believe that there's anybody who never worked for anybody, and that there's anybody who was uninvolved in some way? Because everybody will pretend that they're uninvolved.
Mm-hmm. Okay, just for the people in the back, she's asking whether I know, or to what extent we have people, individual Syrians, who are uninvolved in various forms of violence or crimes. And I think it is important immediately to point out that there are basically 4 parties to this conflict, or at some point at the peak of it there were 4 parties. There were Assad, the rebels, ISIS, and the Kurds. Now if you look at the violence committed against civilians, and you look at all 4 of these, then what we remember most, of course, is those horrific videos of beheadings of ISIS, right? There are some American journalists, for example, who were beheaded. There are many more Syrians who were publicly executed like that in really horrific videos. That says something about the quality of the violence. Pointing a camera, a high-definition camera, and cutting somebody's head off is absolutely horrific. But I would like to argue that doesn't say as much about the quantity of the violence, because it's one individual who's being killed. And even if we add the Yazidi genocide that ISIS committed in 2014, 15, then the numbers of, if you compare these 4 groups, these 4 actors in the conflict, and the violence they committed against civilians, all 3 of these other groups, they pale with the violence that Assad has committed upon his own population, purely statistically. And this is only, if only for the fact that of all these 4 groups, only Assad had an air force. And airplanes are actually right now still bombing civilian areas in the north of Syria. Daily, every day we get 20, 30 people die. Because Assad wants to root out the uprising by any means possible. If that means bombing hospitals, it's bombing hospitals. It's bombing schools, it's bombing bakeries, for example, because there are a lot of people there together. And by, in this kind of total war way, assaulting the civilian infrastructure of rebel areas, he's trying to break the morale. And that level of violence, so purely quantitatively, was not committed by all 3 of these other groups. So nobody is, quote unquote, nobody is clean is a little bit of a simplistic escape, I think, from this question. But there are many Syrians, many civilians actually, and some of them I interviewed, who were offered at some point in this conflict a gun. And for example, somebody I interviewed, his brother was killed by the regime, was arrested and died under torture. And this gentleman was a kind of strong guy, battle age, 25-year-old, healthy young Syrian man. And one of the rebel factions went to him and said, look man, the regime killed your brother. If you come to us, we'll offer you $150 a month as a salary, and you can fight with us and we can get revenge for your brother. And even though emotionally he was totally ready to do that, he didn't. He chose to step away from the violence. Even it would have been kind of morally legitimized for himself. So these people are also very interesting to me, you know. So I have a list of Syrians here. As I said, there's a generational phenomenon. All of these guys picked up arms, but for each one of these that did, there are some who didn't. And that's also important to research. Who rejected and refused to get involved in the violence, either on Assad's side or on anti-Assad side. But that requires a separate lecture that maybe we can do next time. I like re-inviting myself. That's always Martha.
Thank you so much for your lecture. I have like 10 questions, so we'll talk separately
We
about
have all
it.
day.
I'm super interested in the kind of making of the self that is possible through the participation in the Shabbiha and the way that that is layered with the making of the self on social media and the way that they present themselves. And I think there's probably a ton there to unpack. So if you have anything else to say about that, I would be interested in that. Did you interview any remorseful perpetrators, is one of my questions. And what does it mean to fail as a Shabbiha participant? Like, did you hear about or talk to unsuccessful Shabbiha participants? Because you're painting a certain picture of them.
Yeah.
And I'm curious whether
Yes.
there are
Okay.
failed ones. And I want to know what the guy in Aleppo said about the conflict. He said it was interesting, but you didn't say what it was. When you interviewed someone about their interpretation of the conflict, he had an interesting answer.
Yes. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Aleppo. Yeah. Okay. Wait. Okay. I know what it is now. Interpretation. Yeah. Yeah. So this is. Maybe I should start with the last one. Thanks. These are such interesting questions. We could talk about it all day. Well, this one gentleman who was, I interviewed him in 2015, and by that time he was 23. So he was relatively young when the conflict began. And in his opinion, or he saw the conflict actually because he came from a kind of communist family. The Communist Party was still relatively influential in various parts in Syria. And so he saw it actually mostly in class terms. So he said that, well, these Damascus suburbs, these people are not demonstrating because of suppression or lack of political rights, but because of class, because they're poor. But what is interesting is that I pointed out to him, actually, a lot of these people, these Shabbiha, who signed up for Shabbiha, also did that because they were poor. And then he was kind of upset with me, like, what do you mean? Like these? I said, well, according to your own Marxist interpretation, poverty leads to protest against the government. How can we explain that another part of the population that was equally poor actually sided with the power holders, sided with the government? And so we had a little bit of argument there, left and right. And then I gave him that famous book, The Black Book of Communism, about the crimes of communism in the 20th century. And then he got kind of pissed off, and then we stopped talking to each other for a while. But so it's interesting to look at people's interpretations, and he did that, I think, because he wanted to escape from this media narrative that this is a sectarian conflict, and it's understandable. But he was kind of clinging on to another truism or to another kind of monocausal interpretation of the conflict, and it can't be monocausal, of course. Were there any remorseful Shabbiha? There were one or two who became remorseful because they suffered violence by other Shabbiha. So you just go to Khaldun Abu Ali, for example. Man on the right, he was actually poised to become the head of the Shabbiha in Homs because Sabqa Rustam, so it's actually his former boss, was going to be promoted to become Shabbiha of the whole country. And he did. In 2014, Sabqa became head of the NDF in the whole country. and then in 2017 he retired, and now he runs an NGO. Khaldoun, the one who, the NGO that actually runs the hospital in Homs now. So governance, he became important in governance. Now he has civilian clothes. Khaldoun thought, that's great, if Saptar moves on, then I can take power. But he went a little too early, and then he actually became remorseful to the extent that he is the only person, as far as we know, as far as we follow the Syrian state media, the television and the Facebook channels, the only person who went on television and openly said that Saptar Rustam was a criminal for ABC, XYZ. None of these arguments were, of course, about his crimes against humanity, but they were about, well, he's enriching himself, he's arrogant, he doesn't take care of his own soldiers, and corruption charges and things like this. So he became a little bit remorseful, to the extent that he threw in his lot with the wrong guy. And there are a few others. There's one guy, one Shabbiha we interviewed from Homs, who pissed off the wrong people, and then they arrested him, put him in jail, and tortured him for at least a month. And for half of that month he was in solitary confinement. And he became kind of bitter. And almost every time in the interview he was drinking, he was heavily drinking, and very bitter, and lambasting the Shabbiha, and basically regretting the fact that he got involved with these people in the first place. So these are also kind of failures. This is a bit of a failure experiment, and other failures are those people who, of course, the ultimate failure would be is if you threw in your lot with Assad and with Shabbiha in 2011, and then your town or your neighborhood fell to the rebels in 2012, which for a lot of these people actually meant that they were captured or they were assassinated by rebels. And that also has happened, and that also has to be acknowledged, because a lot of these people, the death rates among Shabbiha are also very high. There's a high body count. As for the making of the self, there's too much to unpack here, really. But I kept saying this thing about millennials, right? Because most of my students are millennials. Sometimes I joke about millennials a bit, that you take too many selfies. But if you put millennials in a civil war, this is what you get. At no point during the taking of this photo did he think, wait a minute, maybe this whole Assad business won't work out that well. Maybe I'll have to flee. Maybe in the future this can be used against me. No, just put it out there. The immediate gratification, actually, of the power that it gave him, and actually talked to him also. He talked to me profusely about how fantastic he was with the girls in 2011. Because I had 2 cars. He said, I was 21. I went through the checkpoints. There was no problem. I organized parties every Saturday in the villas outside of Damascus. You should have seen it. People came from the other side of the country to my parties. So that kind of the kind of short-term gain is something that relatively uneducated person actually didn't go to university, high school, and then he quit, worked in jobs left and right a little bit, but the social media plays an incredibly important role, of course, because if you talk a little bit longer with him right now, then there also there's a smattering of depression every once in a while, in that he has some health issues and he feels rather depressed and lonely in Holland. He's not as important as he was in 2011 in Damascus, living off welfare in a small apartment in the periphery of the city. So there's also decline. It didn't all work out the way he wanted to. And now he has to get like a kind of banal job, cutting tulips at the flower market. And that also is kind of a part of itself. So the idea of the good old days, to quote a famous book on the Holocaust, the good old days are gone, and now we have a very different prospect, actually. Yeah? Nice effect.
Are there any women in this organization? And how does gender play out?
Yes.
Is there a masculine culture, wolf culture that we...
Yeah. Is there a masculine culture? Well, if you look at this, what do you think is something that I would say? I mean, in the book, I will have a section on hyper-masculinity. But the interesting thing is, when I showed this to a colleague who works on this phenomenon more directly, on masculinities of combatants, and he said, when I look at this, he said, this looks like gay porn. So this looks actually rather kind of, gay. Because And there are many other pictures. Most of them, they don't have a shirt on, and they're kind of pumped up with their muscles, etc. And they're together, and they touch each other all the time, and they're all over each other. And so I think probably, speaking of making of the self, the fashioning of a hyper-masculine self through violence, by flexing muscles, and by also, let's not forget, committing sexual violence on a scale that's unprecedented in Syrian history, is also definitely part of it. So Shabbiha, if you look at research done on sexual violence in Syria, sexual violence against women, but also against men, then Shabbiha are actually one of the main, if not the main responsibles for this. There are people who suffer sexual violence under detention, so by the intelligence forces. There are many examples of that, but the Shabbiha in particular were accused of various forms of sexual violence. So this is definitely part of it. They believe in many of their posts, actually, when they post a picture like this, the captions will invariably say, the men of the National Defense Forces, real men. You know, so they really feel that this is kind of ideal of masculinity, and so it also becomes like a race to the bottom. So there are also pictures of guys who are like this, and they can't even close their arms anymore because the biceps are all kind of pumped up. And you know, some of them were then, and then you get the mirror image. Some of them are then kidnapped by the rebels, placed in a cell, and then of course those muscles, they blow out like a balloon, and then pictures of that are taken and posted to their Facebook pages, and this is what happens with your masculinity. And to rob men of their masculinity, also a lot of sexual violence is committed against men. There are examples of like hazing, for example, in Shabbiha. When you enter, they kind of, you know, they strip you naked and they make you run, for example, or and that's to their own people. Imagine what they do to opposition guys when they catch them. And there are also, finally, there's a small company of women in Shabbiha, in the NDF. They also have their own page. We didn't manage to do any interviews with them, but it looked like it was kind of, this was a rather desperate attempt by the Assad regime to tap into like Western images of, you know, Kurdish girls fighting against ISIS and things like that. So they wanted to tap into that kind of gendered images of violence that were so prominent in the West, of course. But they were, I mean, we're talking about several dozens of women, and they're totally inconsequential in the fighting.
So, you talked briefly about what happens after they are settled, so to speak. It's kind of land is recaptured, kind of life is going back to a little bit to normal. My question is, how does this work when they have so much power? Yeah? And the Assad regime has now to share the power with them. Is there a distribution that they say, okay, you can have economic power, but you don't get any political representation? Or how does this work? I mean, it's kind of, there should be kind of a collision, right? You talked a little bit that they're because they don't give up arms.
Yeah.
But they don't have arms anymore, but still they have all the networks, they have wealth. So how does this play out?
Yeah, and so for this, I mean, this is really the key issue, is, you know, not only how do these people transform the conflict, but how does the conflict transform them and empower them? And that is really absolutely incredible. So I just want to show you Aleppo is maybe not the best example. Homs is a very good example in which these pro-Assad groups were especially prominent in these neighborhoods. Now, in some of these others, especially the one on the left, Baba Amr, this one, this is a neighborhood that they started mass demonstrating in 2011. They were shot off the street and shelled, and one of the first actually aerial bombings occurred in that neighborhood, mostly under lower class Sunni workers. The neighborhood in 2012 militarized, late 2011, early 2012, militarized, and then when the Free Syrian Army came up in Baba Amr, the Assad regime tried to overpower them by bringing artillery and tanks and whatnot, and they started shelling the city. As soon as that happened, they broke the defenses. The Shabbiha stormed the neighborhood and committed one of the first massacres in February 2012 in this neighborhood. And it's one of the best documented massacres, actually, because the media guys in Baba Amr managed to get away through a tunnel under the river, towards the river, so under the west entrance of the city. They got away, and from the west entrance of Homs, it's only like 20 kilometers, 30 kilometers to the Lebanese border. The guy who got away, he took his external hard drive with all his videos and all of his data, and he came to Germany. He lives in Germany now, and we interviewed him extensively. Very good memory, and what we know from him is that some of the Shabbiha actually that he knew from before, they knew him from high school, right? These people that grew up together, they went to high school together, and then the conflict split them. Now I asked him what is the condition of Baba Amr right now? And this is 2017, when the regime took over the whole city. And he said that actually what the regime committed in Baba Amr is a veritable quote-unquote ethnic cleansing, in that they didn't allow people to return to Baba Amr. So the locals were not allowed to return there. It's in a strategic area, it's close to the university, close to the Shabbiha base, as you can see. And so people were massively expropriated. And what happened with that expropriation? What happened to those properties? Well, the government or the regime dished out title deeds, restaurants, shops, etc., of those buildings that were still standing, sometimes entire buildings, to certain Shabbiha members and bosses. And those people started setting up regular businesses. And those businesses now are, they're running the country. So if you want to buy, for example, medicine in Baba Amr, there's one pharmacy, and that pharmacy is run by a guy who was Shabbiha in 2011. So one of the things always, like in organized crime studies, the point is that what the mafia wants to do is actually they want desperately to become legal. They want to get into legal businesses, not just do illegal things. And a lot of them want to use illegal businesses to get into the legal economy. And Shabbiha, I think the same thing. I think a lot of these guys, they used the opportunity of doing Shabbiha work as a type of climbing, a kind of a ladder to climb, to use social mobility, to jump ranks, and to enrich themselves privately, and also to gain much more influence. And we have one final example. One of the really infamous Shabbiha who was there from the beginning, because a lot of them died also, right? They either were skirmishes or they went out fighting and they died on the battlefield. One guy who was there from the beginning, from 2011, March, still alive, he's on Facebook, he posts like these videos, he becomes Facebook Live. So like I'm eating a snack at home and then all of a sudden, oh, this guy's live, so I click and I follow him. So he's broadcasting from Homs in the same minute actually that I'm in my home in Holland. And in one of the most recent broadcasts, he did something interesting. He was unhappy with the trash collection in his neighborhood, which is Zahra. Right here. He was unhappy with this, this is a government service, of course, with trash collection. And then in this Facebook video, he threatened the mayor, and he said, well, if you don't, show up with some, with some trash collection very soon, then, me and a couple of guys will have to come over and visit you at the municipality. So if anybody else would do that in Syria, threatening publicly in a Facebook post one of the mayors of the top 3 cities of the country, within 10 minutes there would be intelligence at your door and you would be whisked away, and that's the end of you. Not here. The mayor went online and apologized to him and said they would do everything to fix this. So these guys have become almost a shadow state, or something that in Turkey we used to call deep state. So it doesn't have a formal position, not a mayor, he's not in the city hall, it's not a police officer, doesn't have any official position, just has has an Adidas tracksuit and has a couple of AK-47s and his buddies out there in the back. And so, this is where it comes to bite you in the ass again, pardon my language, in that you can create these type of groups, but it might turn around and affect the government. So now, as you can imagine, the trash collection is running through Zahra, and the neighborhood is as clean as you can get. And that's only the beginning of it. Yes, Richard.
I have lots of questions. First, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
So how you describe the ways in which the state is basically farming out shared sovereignty to these paramilitaries. particularly as you describe in this moment where they are finding themselves in contention with the state, which wants to reclaim that sovereignty that it has been sharing. Are they now forming relationships with one another? Are they looking abroad? Are they looking to Lebanon? Are they looking to other groups as a way to kind of leverage their position against the state that now wants to take something back?
Yes. I mean, it's a very legitimate, very important question. So he asks, how do these groups leverage their position so that the state doesn't disempower them again and reins them in? I think that there are a couple of things going on here. One is that these guys have kind of branched out in the world of business, because the word of the day in Syria is rebuilding Syria. So interestingly, some of these guys have gotten involved with, or they set up NGOs in which they argue that they want to rebuild Syria. So you might have, I can show you a couple of websites. You know, it looks like a very smooth website. It says who we are. Well, we're going to rebuild this neighborhood. We're helping communities, etc. Contact, donate. And they look at contact, and wait a minute, there's a Shabbiha guy from 2011 who massacred people in that neighborhood. So they reinvent themselves. And some of them have gotten international donations, actually. So I think that was kind of interesting. I mean, they themselves destroyed the neighborhood, and then in 2019 they set up an NGO to rebuild the neighborhood. So I think that's one way to get involved in the world of NGOs, business. NGOs also, because the Syrian state is profoundly weakened. You know, it is also really the case that the state has been impoverished and has been critically weakened because of years and years of fighting this war. And so it can't pay salaries. So Shabbiha have actually taken over certain state functions, such as distribution of food to the poor. In some cases, they've set up kindergartens. Like Sapta Rustam set up a kindergarten. There's on his Facebook page, you can see him playing with children. And so this is the way that they try to branch out, by actually, so in a populist way. Business on the one hand, and on the other hand, by providing services that locals, loyalist communities need. And that so far has been fairly successful, because that way they also entrench themselves and go legit. And as you go legit, then actually the government feels that, or has felt so far, that they've been doing a good job, or they've been useful in peacetime as they were useful in wartime. But that remains to be seen also. Let's see how this is going to play out in the future. One thing that's never going to happen, is my prediction, is that they're never going to be disempowered to the position that they were before the conflict, and they're not going to be disarmed anytime soon, I think.
I'm just curious, are you seeing the different paramilitaries in different parts of the country forming relationships with one another, branching out, trying to create sectors or take command of their sectors of the economy,
Yes.
not just dominate locally?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you see that, and what you also see, so apart from NGOs and from business, what you also see is those who want to stay in the world of security. Some of them have set up private security companies, like Blackwater. So you can just hire a Shabbiha, and if you have a problem in the Democratic Republic of Congo, then you can send them there. Or some of them who wanted to stay inside Syria, they have managed to use their Shabbiha position to be promoted to one of the official positions. So they ended up, just to go back to this, to either one of the green bullet points or one of the blue bullet points. And some of them have been promoted, let's say, they made the lateral leap from the Shabbiha informal position to, for example, the 4th Armored Brigade. And now they work for them.
I think.
I just want to thank you for these two folded insights, one in kind of perpetrator studies, but also into Syria, where we don't have a lot of inside information because there's so much going on. If you don't really study it, you can't really make sense of many things which are happening. So thank you a lot, and I hope we get you back at some point.
Thank you.